We are now recording. We are now recording. Oh, thank you. I'm hearing lots of echo. Thank you, Robin, for this. What I'm going to do is I'm very briefly going to mute Val, even though he's not yet speaking. And may I ask everybody at home to mute as well? And may I just now ask, has that reduced the amount of echo? Excellent, thank you very much. Thanks so much for the feedback from home. Because of the two laptops, sadly, we're not going to be able to have spoken comments, but comments in the chat will be much appreciated. So do feel free to use that. Our pattern, we're going to have 45 minutes from Val, then a break, then another 45 minutes. Welcome to the Oxford Centre for Spiritual Growth, hosted here at St Michael at the Church. And we know one of the great features of the Centre for Spiritual Growth is its links, its relationships with all sorts of churches and people from all backgrounds. But we at St Michael's are delighted to support as much as we can. So thank you, Ben, as ever, for involving us. Now, if I were to introduce Val Cunningham at full length, then we'd be here all afternoon. And, oh, sorry, another request for everybody kindly to mute. Thanks so much, Karen, for reminding us about that. So Val is retired, here we go, I did have it here, retired Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Oxford, always a good place to be, Emeritus Fellow in English Literature at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, a long and distinguished career and speaking, it seems to me, most of the universities of the known world. So I'm not going to list them all. Fascinated in literature, especially I think post-Elizabethan, and is MA, DPhil, Oxon, and OBE. Congratulations on that a couple of years ago for services for English literature. This afternoon, we're going to hear a little bit about D.H. Lawrence and his poetry. I'm now going to confess my ignorance. Until this afternoon was suggested, I knew very little about D.H. Lawrence's poetry, so looking forward to learning lots. One of the great things about OCSG is that we see the truth, the beauty and love of God in all sorts of places, expected and unexpected. And so we look forward to this afternoon. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Val. Just before he strides forward to the lectern, I'm going to unmute him. Otherwise, that's not going to go well. I'll then come back and mute myself here before you start speaking. Yes, sure, in the old days, we didn't have all this complication. Ready to go?
Thank you very much. In the presence of so much technology, I'm always amazed. I need to decide which glasses to wear. Either these bifocals or these reading glasses. I think probably these. It's a case of not being able to read your own handwriting. If you're not careful. D.H. Lawrence. I give you his dates because what is very significant about him is that his life was quite short. He was born in 1885 and died in 1930 and produced an extraordinary amount of writing in what we should think of as not a long life. He is, of course, a very great 20th century novelist and poet. And it's important that we should hang on to that idea. There was a period when he went out of academic fashion, but I think, and was dismissed by feminist critics who got hold of him as a sexual pig, really, and that put him off a lot of university courses. But he's made his way back on again quite properly, I think. What's most important about him is that he is an English writer and an English provincial writer, born in the working class, the fourth child of a coal miner. He born in Eastwood on the Nottingham-Derbyshire border. He was, of course, very bright, was a scholarship boy to Nottingham High School, who later on became a school teacher after a short period of study at University College, Nottingham. He taught briefly before moving away from Eastwood, from his roots, from his home, to London, then to Germany, to Italy, to Crete, to Sicily, to Australia, America, New Mexico, all over the world. He went to Germany, of course, because he'd married a German, Frieda von Richthofen, who was sister of the famous Red Baron, the flying ace of Germany. And that's why he went to Germany for a while, at least on and off, actually. He was, of course, the son of a very religious Christian mother, and in keeping with his growing up in that English provincial town and being from a working class family, well, more or less, where father was a coal miner, his mother was a bit more bourgeois than that. But he, like her, he belonged to provincial, not Anglican congregation. She was a Congregationalist, and so was he. He was brought up in the Congregationalist church in provincial chapel culture, a culture which was, of course, biblical and biblicist in the extreme, which is I want to hang on to, and that's a part of the special focus of these thoughts. He died aged 45 in Italy, and he, after a life of being always unmoored, you might say, restless, never at home, after leaving home, he was archetypally unsettled writer, always moving on in all kinds of ways, moving on socially, as he put it, becoming sort of bourgeoisified, moving on politically, you might say, always questing for a new political home, always in search for the great good place, a kind of utopia, which would be the ideal practical political circumstance. He had ideas of setting up a community of friends at one point, which didn't work, friends, intellectuals, writers, and so on. Always moving on, never settling down, moving on in his writing. An early provincial realist, and that's the emphasis of a lot of today. But on doing that, moving away, attacking the old kind of fiction that he started writing, attacking what he called the old stable ego of the fictional character, the certain moral scheme of traditional fiction, and so on. Moving on, and above all, moving on in his beliefs. Brought up as a nonconformist, he was a traditionally orthodox believer, and moved into, gradually, but very firmly, into unorthodoxy, moving away into a more or less, more and more post-Christian, even pre-Christianity, taken up and down, as you might say, into Greekism and primitivism, and so forth, ending up very keen on ancient mysticism, and towards the end of his life, ending up as an admirer of Mexican Aztec blood cultism. Never settled, never allowed to settle. Never allowed to settle. It was always being pushed on and pushed out. When he visited his German relations, they deplored his Englishness. Coming back to England, settling in Cornwall, overlooking the shipping lanes, he was reported to in the First World War, he was reported to the police as a spy. After all, he had a German wife, didn't he? And so on. His books were seized for obscenity by the police. His paintings were put into jail, as he put it, for obscenity and so on. His writing was doctored, and that will be one of the themes of today, doctored, abused, mucked about, we might say, by misunderstanding editors and critics. Even his admirers proceeded with their fingers crossed. A typical production is his editor and friend, Richard Aldington's life. Admirer, promoter, editor, and so on, who called his life portrait of a genius, but. And there's always a but knocking around, both in Lawrence's writing and also in the consideration of Lawrence. He is, in other words, a perennial outsider in selfhood, in art, in religion. Always, as he put it in one of his poems, an in-between. And that's in the poem called Red Herring, which is about his childhood, brought up by a coal miner father and a mother who was a bit posher than that. Socially, as he put it from the start, sort of stuck between in class terms. The children in that poem are celebrated for speaking standard English at home, calling each other you, but dialect outside, thou and thee, and so on. And he says in that poem, the children, we remain still in between. We're in between, socially, culturally, and he might have also said religiously as well. But in between this meant, it seems to me, never cutting entirely loose from the original, the genetic, and especially the provincial chapel culture and religion he grew up in. That, it seems to me, and this is what it seems to be the gist of Sons and Lovers, that culture infected, shaped, and coated everything. His imagination, his writing, his unstoppable religiosity, which is why, of course, I want to stress that aspect of Sons and Lovers, and to start a consideration of Lawrence with that novel. His first major fiction, he published earlier stuff, but this is his first big one, and I offer it as important precisely because of its foundational, its genetic aspect and content. Let me illustrate this kind of positioning of Lawrence's work by referring you to chapter 6. Sorry, I don't have a handout for the prose. Chapter 6, Death in the Family. It is, you remember, about the death of Paul's older brother, William, who had been mixed up, moved to London, been mixed up with a southern petty bourgeois woman, a terrible person who comes on a painful visit to Bestwood and stays discomfortingly with the Morell family. William dies alone in London of pneumonia, and his body is brought back home. And there's a discussion of what they will do with the coffin. and this is Mrs. Morell, the coffin will be here tonight, Walter. You'd better see about some help. And the house was dead silent. After an hour, Morell, troubled and bewildered, came in. Where shall we have him when he does come? He asked his wife. And she says, in the front room. Then I'd better shift the table. Yes. And have him across the chairs? You know there. Yes, I suppose so. Morell and Paul went with a candle into the parlour. There was no gas there. The father unscrewed the top of the big mahogany oval table and cleared the middle of the room. Then he arranged 6 chairs opposite each other so that the coffin could stand on their beds. You never see such a length as he is, said the miner, and watching anxiously as he worked. At 10 o'clock, Morell called, he's here. Everyone started. There was a noise of unbarring and unlocking the front door, which opened straight from the night into the room. Bring another candle, called Morell. Down the middle of the cleared room waited 6 chairs, face to face. In the window against the lace curtains, Arthur, another boy, held up one candle, and by the open door against the night, Annie, the sister, stood leaning forward, a brass candlestick glittering. There was the noise of wheels. Outside, in the darkness of the street below, Paul could see horses and a black vehicle, one lamp and a few pale faces. Then some men, miners, all in their shirt sleeves, seemed to struggle in the obscurity. Presently 2 men appeared, bowed beneath a great weight. It was Morell and his neighbour, Steady, called Morell, out of breath. William, of course, was big, 6 foot odd. A big boy who was a big boy. He and his fellow, Morell and his fellow, mounted the steep garden step, heaved into the candlelight with a gleaming coffin end. Limbs of other men were seen struggling behind. Morell and Burns, colleague miner, in front, staggered. The great dark weight swayed. Steady, steady, cried Morell as if in pain. All the 6 bearers were up in the small garden, holding the great coffin aloft. There were 3 more steps to the door. The yellow lamp of the carriage shone alone down in the black road. Now then, said Morell. The coffin swayed. The men began to mount the 3 steps with their load. Annie's candle flickered, and she whimpered as the first men appeared, and the limbs and bowed heads of 6 men struggled to climb into the room, bearing the coffin that rode like sorrow on their living flesh. Oh, my son, Mr. Morell sang softly, and each time the coffin swung to the unequal climbing of the men. Oh, my son, my son, my son. Mother, Paul whimpered. She did not hear. Oh, my son, she repeated. Paul saw drops of sweat fall from his father's brow. 6 men were in the room, 6 coatless men with yielding, struggling limbs, filling the room and knocking against the furniture. The coffin veered and was gently lowered onto the chairs. The sweat fell from Morell's face on its boards. My word, he's a weight, said a man, and the 5 miners sighed, bowed, and trembling with a struggle, descended the steps again, closing the door behind them. The family was alone in the parlour with a great polished box. William, when laid out, was 6 feet 4 inches long. Like a monument lay the bright brown, ponderous coffin. They buried him on the Monday in the little cemetery on the hillside that looks over the fields at the big church and the houses. It was sunny, and the white chrysanthemums frilled themselves in the warmth. Mrs. Morell could not be persuaded after this to talk and take her old bright interest in life. She remained shut off all the way home in the train. She had said to herself, if only it would have been me. An extraordinary passage. The dead boy comes home. It's about home. It is, of course, a small working class house. The front room leads straight into the street. It's about community, working class, togetherness, men, coal miners, men with bodies, with this big heavy coffin with a big body inside it. Great stress on their limbs, bodies. It's work, this. It's hard work. It's struggle. They sweat. Morel, of course, had to be fetched home from the pit to hear of his son's death. And of course it is typically a religious, a biblicized occasion. Sweat. They sweat like Jesus on the cross. The chairs are body to body, face to face. This is a knowing, seems to be echoes of Paul in 1 Corinthians about how we shall know perfectly when we see Christ face to face. The mother keeps saying, "Oh, my son, my son." And then, if only it would have been me. It's the voice of King David, the poet king, hearing of his son Absalom's death. And the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." Mrs. Morel is utterly inside the biblical text. Quoting the Bible comes naturally, utterly naturally to her, because the meaning of her selfhood, her world, all totally constrained, shaped, educated, fashioned by the Bible, that's been dinned into her by private reading, by public reading in chapel, by sermon after sermon, ministers expounding, applying the Bible to the chapel goers' lives. She is a typical Bible-shaped nonconformist. And so was David Lawrence. David Lawrence, named, as so many nonconformists were, for a Bible character, in this case, the poet king whose words Mrs. Morel is using. David Lawrence, brought up in Eastwood's Congregationalist Chapel, Sunday school attender, hearer of so many sermons. The Bible dinned into him, forming him in every day and every way, loading him with images, metaphors, the words for meaning and understanding self and the world, for morality, for purpose in life, for ideas about death and time and God, his great themes. And what is shown coming naturally to Mrs. Morel comes naturally to her, him, writing about her, because her words and her world are his world and his words. Relationship with the Bible becomes and is there and elsewhere a large sign of the nature of these people, a key to these people's doings, and of course to the nature of this great novel of growing up, this Bildungsroman. Take another case, take chapter 9, the defeat of Miriam. We've reached a point in Paul's growing up of dissatisfaction. He is dissatisfied. He always will be, like Lawrence, never ending up in a satisfied position. He is his dissatisfaction. And it manifests itself in focusing on Miriam, Paul's second love after his mother. There's always this moving on from one beloved to another. This recognition or indication or fiction of the defeat is done as ever in terms of a relationship with the Bible, Bible reading, Bible meaning. When that's Miriam and Edgar and he, as Paul walked home together from chapel or from the Literary Society in Bestwood, that's the one run by efforts done by the Congregationalist minister of Eastwood. She knew his talk, so passionate and so unorthodox nowadays. One Sunday evening, and very interesting about this novel is, of course, so many episodes are typical. You're not told exactly when. Okay, it's a typical. Here's an example of what happened a lot. One Sunday evening, they attained to their old rare harmony. Edgar stayed to communion with Mrs. Morell. So Paul came on alone with Miriam to his home, always home. He was more or less under her spell again. As usual, they were discussing the sermon. He was setting now full sail towards agnosticism, but such a religious agnosticism that Miriam didn't suffer so badly. They were at the Renan vie de Jesus stage. Miriam was the threshing floor on which he threshed out all his beliefs. While he trampled his ideas upon her soul, the truth came out for him. She alone was his threshing floor. She alone helped him towards realization, almost impassive. She submitted to his argument and his expounding. And somehow, because of her, he gradually realized where he was wrong. And what he realized, she felt he couldn't do without her. She liked him on Sundays, typically. Then he wore a dark suit that showed the lithe movement of his body. There was a clean, clear-cut look about him. He went on with his thinking to her. Suddenly he reached for a Bible. Miriam liked the way that he reached up so sharp, straight to the mark. He turned the pages quickly and read her a chapter of St. John. As he sat in the armchair reading, intent, his voice only thinking, she felt as if he were using her unconsciously, as a man uses his tools at some work he's bent on. She loved it, and the wistfulness of his voice was like a reaching to something, and it was as if she were what he reached with. She sat back on the sofa, away from him, and yet feeling herself the very instrument his hand grasped. Then it gave her great pleasure. Then he began to falter and to get self-conscious. And when he came to the verse, a woman, when she's in travail, has sorrow because her hour is come, he missed it out. Miriam had felt him growing uncomfortable. She shrank when the well-known words did not follow. He went on reading, but she did not hear. A grief and shame made her bend her head. One Sunday evening, she liked him on Sundays. This is the kind of thing. They go to chapel, they hear sermons, they discuss it. It's about their talk after chapel, after a sermon. Talk typical, as we've been told, of their post-chapel, post-literary society talk. And it is increasingly unorthodox. They've been reading Renan's Vie de Jesus, The Life of Jesus, came out in English in 1864, secularizing, humanizing, and hostile to inspiration. Paul is now the expositor. They've heard an exposition, they've been to a sermon, but now Paul is the expounder. He is the rival preacher. His audience is Miriam, a rival audience, the biblical audience, the threshing floor of his ideas. Biblical reading is word. The Bible is a tool. This is a non-reformist, working class activity, reading the Bible. But now, arrestingly, this far into the novel, now a highly edited reading. The Bible is being cut. John 16:21, that verse about the anguish of childbirth replaced by joy at a man-child's birth, he cuts it out. It's a scotch, we're told, which is a working term. A scotch is a wedge inserted to stop a wheel turning. It's also a term from theological debate. In the past, heretics' writings were said to be scotched, got rid of. It's an edited reading. There is a cut. Lawrence assumes that you will know that you will be familiar with the Bible as he is. These are well-known words that have been dropped. They're well known to him. And he assumes to you, perhaps wrongly, this of course is an author's cut. An author's cut. The writer, D.H. Lawrence, the author, arranging to have his Bible reader cutting the passage. But it is also, interestingly, like so many such passages in Paul's Sons and Lovers, an editorially cut passage. There's a cutting by Paul Morell, or should we say, by D.H. Lawrence through Paul Morell, and also an editorial cut. An editor has interfered with this Bible passage. There's a double cutting or editing having gone on. What's been left out by the editor, Michael Garnett, is the original detail that was there about the Bible, this Bible. Originally, the text said it was a shilling one his mother had given him when he was 11. His Bible is Paul's Bible. The book is identified and placed in this growing up in a provincial chapel world. Mother gave it to him when he was 11. It's a lovely revealing detail, and losing it is a loss in every sense. But it's also a religious loss, or a loss in the religious business, a revealing one. It's a small example of the extraordinary, massive cutting that went on editorially in Sons and Lovers. About a tenth of the original was cut by the editor, Edward Garnett. He argued that this was to make the things easy to read, too much detail, he said. Let's smooth it out, polish it up, sharpen the focus, and so on. Let's make for reader happiness, too much prolixity. Okay. But that was his argument, and Lawrence went along with that. But arrestingly, to me anyway, what was deleted was a great deal of material, detail, about Midland's working class life, what you might think of the novel's fine sociology and even anthropology, which was very much clarified or focused in those cut passages about reading and doing and thinking and saying, and going to the library and cooking and so on and so on, but also involving very much the activity of the chapel and the Association Literary Society. Material, religious material, beyond the ken of the southern bourgeois, unchristian Edward Garnett. There are examples all over the place. In chapter 2, there was a long passage about Mrs. Morell arguing with her minister over the way he's read the Bible. Read the wedding at Cana of Galilee. She bullies him, which is bullying. She likes bullying the minister over his readings. He's treated it symbolically. No, it's not symbolic. She said it's real. It's actual. It's about real people. You know, it's about the father-in-law's worry over the wine at the wedding. Don't make it symbolic, man. This is realism. Gone. Chapter 3, there's a cut about involving William's shirt. His shirt's been much patched. It's got a lot of got a lot of patches on it. It's kind of multicolored. And he says, it's my Joseph's coat. My Joseph's coat, referring to the biblical example or case of Joseph, the man with a coat of many colours. Gone. Chapter 6. Mrs. Morell spends a lot of time describing to Paul Mrs. Levers. Mrs. Levers as the woman who lets you down in terms of appearance at chapel. She refuses to keep up her appearance. She's worn the same old hat year by year, Sunday after Sunday. She's not poor. She could afford a new one, but she never does. And there she is, sitting opposite us in chapel. Mother to Paul. Chapel life, chapel experience, chapel realism, chapel thoughts. Gone. That's followed by a passage about Mrs. Morell frying rhubarb fritters for Paul's supper. Fritters. I take it we're meant to think working class stuff, food, okay? Fritters that stuck, I hope, in Lawrence's memory from reading his fellow Congregationalist Robert Browning's wonderful description of a character's voice in The Ring and the Book as a person speaking as he had fritters deep down frying there. Typically of these kind of cuts is in chapter 3, where we have a very brief mention of the barn man. The barn man. He's a door-to-door seller of barn, that is of yeast. In the text that was finally allowed out, he appears, just arrives, and just there, he's mentioned, before Mrs. Morell has a quarrel with her neighbour, Mrs. Anthony, calling her about their son's bad behaviour. You remember William has behaved badly, it's alleged, and so on. Neighbours calling, it made much more sense in the original, cited in a proletarian world of callings. In this case, the calling aloud of the barn man who sings as a kind of patter, a religious patter, singing sort of bits of hymns. His sales talk is a pastiche of evangelistic, nonconformist summoning. It both starts off the episode, just mentioned, and in the original, he initiates this discussion and then interrupts their discourse. All gone. Here's how it went originally before the cut. All this replaced by a single sentence about the barn man. Quite mystifying, actually. Piece of provincial realism, working class life, the door-to-door salesman of yeast, who is also highly nonconformist of a particular sort. One morning, I'll read you the passage that was cut. One morning, Mrs. Morell, hearing Balm-O, went down into the alley with her mug. Balm-O was not yet up to her gate. So she stood waiting, listening to the snatches of hymns the man was singing as he dipped the can into his barrels and filled the pots the women gave him. He was a cheerful old man with a rather bulbous comic face surrounded with white whiskers. In his decrepit old cart were 2 barrels of brewer's yeast covered with a wet sack. He's just called the barman, by the way, as in the printed published version. But here, barm would be explained as yeast, by the way, covered with a wet sack. As he went along, he sang snatches of hymns. since he had been converted 3 months before. We shall meet beyond the river where the surges cease to roll. Barmo, came his big half-wicked cry down the alley, and he chaffed the women as he served them with their ha'porths of balm. Suddenly Mrs. Morell heard a voice calling her. It was thin little Mrs. Anthony in Belvedere. Here, Mrs. Morell, I want to tell you about your Willie. Oh, do you? Replied Mrs. Morell. Mrs. Morell Anthony did not come close, but stood and shouted across the alley. And there's a bit of that altercation about the children, and it continues in the original with the voice of Barmo. At the cross, where I found Barmo, Barmoo, how much this dip, missus? A haver will do, said Mrs. Morell, handing up her mug. A haver's in this mug, and here you are, all fresh and dripping, and God's blessing on you, replied Barmo. Here this cart stood between the two women. Consider the lilies, how they grow. Yes, Mrs. Anthony, a haper, all hapers, do I, they toil not, neither do they spin, yet even Solomon, thank you. He moved on, having made not the slightest impression on the two women. His singing is a blend of evangelical hymns about meeting beyond the river by revivalist Moody and Sankey, and from the Salvation Army hymn book of revival music for evangelical services, open air meetings, and the home circle, 1876, compiled, nonetheless, wonderfully, by Nottingham's own William Booth, the Salvation Army's founder, a one-time local Reform Methodist lay preacher. Those are there with a half-remembered bit of the 19th century American revivalist chorus at the cross, where I first saw the light, written by the American Salvation Army admirer, a Methodist called Ralph Hudson. The barman is a recent convert. He was converted, we told, 3 months before, but he's rather up on revivalist music, and it made not the slightest impression on the two women, and nor did it, or does it, on D.H. Lawrence. He's singing the wrong kind of hymns. Hymn singing are main to D.H. Lawrence's reports of growing up in nonconformity, but not that sort of hymn. There's this wonderful late piece called Hymns in Man's Life, which appeared in Evening News towards the end of Lawrence's life in 1928, in which he says that hymns are the poetry that he finds finest in the world. Hymns are glamorous words, glamour, key word, as we shall see later on for D.H. Lawrence. It rhymes with grammar, glamour, grammar, grammar, the poet's stuff. Glamorous words and worlds, says Lawrence, words like Galilee that penetrated his childhood, filling him with wonder, wonder generated, as he puts it, in the Congregationalist Sunday School. In other words, a world, as Lawrence puts it, worlds apart from the snobbish Church of England people, a non-working class lot around him, and also worlds apart from the revivalistic, nonconformist and very working class primitive Methodists who sing hymns like the Barman's. Lawrence doesn't like those either. Congregation hymns are somewhere in the middle, in between, you might say. Hymns are clearly apart from Anglicanism and also from the messy religious sentimentalism of Moody and Sankey. Hymns promoting, his hymns promote a cool beauty of holiness, a truly, perfectly, for Lawrence, located Buddhism. They certainly, in his experience, his kind of hymn did not ask you to get saved like the Balm Man. Later on, in one of his discussions of the last book of the Bible, Lawrence says, I was never saved, he said. I was not going to be saved. I didn't grow up on people who asked me to be saved. Like the bondman. That confession in Hymns in the Man's Life would seem to have been the trigger for T.S. Eliot's momentous attack on D.H. Lawrence in a very important book called After Strange Gods, a primer in modern heresy in 1934, lectures given in Virginia by Eliot. In that set of lectures, Lawrence is the largest example of the collapse of good Christian tradition and orthodoxy into diabolism, in fact, that's gone on in 20th century literature. In those lectures, T.S. Eliot says some extraordinary things. Lawrence's people have no moral sense. They're spiritual, all right, like Lawrence, but they are spiritually sick, I quote. And that's because Lawrence has been brought up in the theological and religious decadence for Eliot of modern Protestantism, i.e. modern nonconformity. He's outside the pale of the Church of England. He is, as Eliot puts it, uneducated. He's an untaught man. Having graduated from University College Nottingham doesn't count. He would know better had he been to Oxford, which of course he was excluded from as a nonconformist like Browning. Oxford hegemonically Anglican as well as non-working class. The attack on Lawrence is the voice of one-time American dissenter, T.S. Eliot, who brought up a Unitarian, not long before anglicised, became an Englishman, and converted to the Church of England. It's the right-wing anti-nonconformist line of Matthew Arnold, Eliot's inspiration, Eliot, Anglican, Oxonian, in his famous 19th century book, Culture and Anarchy, stereotypical stuff. T.S. Eliot has no idea of the serious thinking, social, literary and religious concerns, which are the everyday interests of the Eastwood Literary Society and other chapel-based discussion groups that Lawrence was involved with, which in fact, when you look at the content of those discussion groups, they knock spots off the pervasive intellectual shallowness of then contemporary Oxford. And interestingly, this is a critique of Lawrence focused on hymns. And I quote from Eliot, where he talks about the vague hymn-singing pietism which seems to have consoled the miseries of Lawrence's mother and which does not seem to have provided her with any firm principles by which to scrutinise the conduct of her sons. It's an extraordinary take on the mother and her sons in Sons of Lovers, on the mother's serious piety and on the piety of the hymns that D.H. Lawrence praises in Hymns in a Man's Life. Now, Eliot was, of course, right to spot D.H. Lawrence's way into unorthodoxy, the patient drift from it, the rewriting, the overturning, the running away, going beyond it, even extreme turning it inside out, upside down. The Bible's Christian way is not Paul's, we're told in chapter 7. He no longer believes Jesus' words about God noticing the fall of the sparrow and counting the hairs of your head. There is a proper way, he says, but he'll find it on his own now. Miriam asks him, do you know when we're following the true way? Yes, he replies, I do. I know what I'm following mine. Which is a pursuit, of course, never actually resolved in Lawrence's life. Everywhere in this novel, there is a de-transcendentalizing, a secularizing going on, quite in the spirit of the German Protestants that Lawrence has read, like Ludwig Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, which so influenced Karl Marx and George Eliot, a book that George Eliot translated, witnessing to a Protestant Feuerbach, of course, German Protestant, bearing witness to the only viability now of a secularized version of orthodoxy, biblical orthodoxy properly and well continued now in a de-transcendentalized way. Every meal should be a Eucharist and all that kind of thing. And so Miriam ponders Paul's words, like the Virgin Mary. She's with this. And she and Paul, we're told, have a communion together. There is this humanizing or de-transcendentalizing of orthodox positions, which are thought of as not getting rid of them, not undoing them, but continuing them properly. Loving Paul, we're told, is almost an ecstasy. Discovering him, we're told, is like an annunciation, the angelic announcement of divine pregnancy to Mary. In the same spirit, Paul, when he paints trees in sunset, is said to be doing a mosaic world. This is Mosaism for modernity. There's God's burning bush for you that burnt not away. Lawrence is obsessed with the beginning of John's Gospel and the Word was made flesh. The orthodox idea of divinity becoming human, incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, flesh and Word united. He's obsessed with this. Flesh is, of course, the large subject of his art, of his words, all those limbs, all those bodies in the sexual encounters of the text and the paintings. Words which he wants to believe are divine per se. Words reflecting human life, actually realizing the actuality, the ordinariness of ordinary life, which, however, will be per se divine. Flesh and word, word and flesh. It's the subject of another repression, the suppressed forward to Sons and Lovers, which was a gloss on his fiction and a parade of this kind of union. His novels, and his novels plural, their generation, are presented as a divine word, a word divine, a word from God, a word of God, made flesh, actually, really, actual ordinary flesh, ordinariness, quotidian ordinariness, the natural, the human world, which is truly divine. It's, he alleges, at the same time, godly indeed. And of course, you find that, I think, wonderfully, convincingly celebrated very often. Like, remember Mrs. Morell going in chapter 1, locked out by her angry husband, upset and quarrelling. She'd been locked out in the moonlight. She's delirious with aggravation among the lilies, touching the flowers, drinking a deep draught of the scent, we're told. It made her dizzy, swooning, out of herself. In the mysterious out of doors, she felt forlorn, we're told. But when she's let back in, she does all the working class things. She puts out her husband's pit clothes and a snap bottle and a bag and so on. And then she looks in the mirror and she smiles faintly, her face all smeared with the yellow dust of lilies, pollen on her face. It's an anointing, a beneficence, blessing from the gardener, the blessedness of flowers. Flowers are everywhere, as we go on thinking. Nature's divine blessing, there and everywhere. It's the divinity of the ordinary. It can, of course, get out of hand, become exaggerated, absurd even, close to mere fantasy, a set of fantastic assertions. I think of just an example of this, of Ursula in The Rainbow, chapter 7, Lawrence's spokesperson after church on a Sunday, angry as she feels, puts it with evangelicalism, with, quote, the desecrating hands of the revivalists which wanted to drag Jesus into this everyday life. She's vexed by biblical literalism, but wondering who the text in Genesis about the sons of God refers to. Who were they, those sons of God, who, quote, saw the daughters of men that they were fair and took them wives of all which they chose? Is Kremensky one of them, she wonders. Lawrence is obsessed with those sons of God who know the daughters of men. Who are they? Mysterious characters, by the way, in the book of Genesis. Later on, we're told in one of his rhapsodies about the last book of the Bible, they had the members of horses, he says. Talk about phallogocentrism. It's an easily mockable overdoing. You can't fail to be sympathetic with T.S. Eliot's slighting of Lawrence's revered hymn-singing blood cult Aztecs of the plumed serpent and mornings in Mexico as capering redskins, as he put it. That's understandable. Lawrence had a word for this, an interesting word. Forever priestly, of course, Lawrence was increasingly tempted not just to preach, to expound, but to do it rantingly. What a ranter I am, he admits to Miriam in one of his farewell positionings, his farewell letter of chapter 9. He's accusing her of being a nun, wholly all right, but mistakenly so, not keen on unmarried sex, bad about the body, about the flesh, at least as far as he's concerned, never yielding to his kept up admonishing. He's going on and on and on about flesh. And he knows he's gone on and on and on about it. What a ranter I am. It's a very interesting knowing local textured accusation, a self-accusation. He is a ranter. He knows that he has this terrible way of turning into one of the much deplored wrong kind of nonconformists that he was always arguing against. The primitive Methodists who were first dubbed ranters for singing in the street, vendors of open-air vendors of religion, open-air evangelists singing in the streets in Belper, Derbyshire, just up the road from Eastwood. Balmy, Lawrence clearly thought, vendors of religious balm. At least Lawrence might have thought that. Certainly no balm for that kind of religiosity in his book, which he admits to not being able to keep himself utterly separate from, forever, we might say, in between. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I said all that muted, so I'll say it again. Technology seemed to work well here. Hope it worked well at home. Thank you so much, Al. It was so rich. So much we could say, but we are going to have a little break now. If anybody does have comments or questions, we can put those in the chat. And I think we'll get back together. Should we say 20 past 3? 20 past 3? And so that gives us, I think, about 15 minutes here. So do feel free to go and get yourselves a cup of coffee or anything. I am going to pause record so I can. And Elizabeth has reminded me about recording, so we are recording again.
Thank you.
Is Eliot right to suggest that there was a decline? It's interesting who he quotes. He mentions Yeats and says, yeah, well, there you are, Yeats, interested in kind of folklore and other kind of mad things like theosophy and so on. There's an example. He could point to all kinds of, if you like, post-Christians, and who would kind of sustain his idea about a move from orthodoxy. At one point in his lecture, he said, I expect you want me to mention Hopkins. Wasn't he orthodox? And interestingly, he said, well, only up to a point, Lord Copper. And he said, I'm defining orthodoxy as a relationship to tradition. That's Eliot's big concern. How do you stand in relation to the great Christian tradition, as he saw it, which he thought that he had joined by becoming an Anglican? What about Hopkins? And then he makes this interesting observation. Well, you know, Hopkins was a Roman Catholic convert, and converts are always dubious. And that's the end to the Hopkins question. I think that's absurd. Hopkins is a good example, it seems to me, of somebody who was a spokesperson for what you might call orthodoxy. And one of the most interesting things about 20th century, the young poets at the beginning of the 20th century, is that they discovered Hopkins. And there's a Hopkins movement, people like W.H. Auden and so on. They are absolutely overwhelmed by the publication of Hopkins. Hopkins had mainly not been published in his own lifetime. He's been brought to their attention, and they're absolutely overwhelmed. Often it's a formalism and so on, but it was, of course, an intense lyricism, the form of Hopkins' poems, modelled on the form of the Psalms, which had been broken, encoded, as it were, or disencoded by investigators. And Hopkins is absolutely besotted by the Psalms and models himself on Psalm construction. Interestingly, he represents, in a way, the counter movement in the 20th century. Not surprisingly, a bit later on, W.H. Auden, who had left Christianity, rejoined it after having seen burnt churches in Spain. He turned his back on Christianity. You know, it's a wonderful story of T.S. Eliot belonged to a church in London where Christopher Isherwood's mother was also a member, and she persuaded him one Christmas Eve to go along to the service, and Isherwood was astonished to see a person taking up the collection was T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, who represented everything that was bad as far as he was concerned. He was a church warden there, and Isherwood is totally astonished. Isherwood, of course, did not return to Christianity, unlike Auden, but he did become a kind of Buddhist. That sort of counts, I suppose, as a kind of part of a religious term. I don't think, certainly Eliot did not regard Buddhists as beyond the pale. Anyway, so there is throwing, but there's also toing in the 20th century.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So feel free now, Val, to go into the next part of the talk. Thank you.
This second talk is about Lawrence the poet. He is an extraordinary, prolific poet. Hundreds of poems, hundreds of them. This major 20th century novelist is also a major 20th century poet. He is a poet of many colours, so to say, many kinds, thrusts, directions, but always this great variety converging on his main preoccupations, poems echoing each other, comprising an oeuvre, as T.S. Eliot would put it. What did you win the Nobel Prize for? Eliot was asked when he got off the plane. He said, for the oeuvre. There is a Hopkins, there is a Lawrence oeuvre. Poems always self-centered, always about me, always about I. But self, often and very commonly looking out at the world, at nature. He's one of the greatest English nature poets, looking out at culture, civilization, asking questions about modernity, but always as they impinge on him, the eye of this literature. Poems that talk aloud, increasingly colloquial. He was greatly admiring of Walt Whitman for this aspect. Doing the voices, as Dickens put it in a statement much admired by T.S. Eliot, doing the voices, listening, reproducing the voices of others. Poems by a person who is a huge reader of poetry, recent poetry, ancient poetry, classical languages poetry, usually in translation, but poetry in the languages he's familiar with, French, German, and Italian. Poetry that is, of course, repeatedly religious, centered on myth in the best sense. Its poetry is frequently about me and God, or the gods, God and the gods, and me. Poems, of course, intimate with his own prose fictions. Often poems addressed to women as they appear or rise in his fictions. He sees himself as writing to women that he will call Miriam, as in Sons and Lovers. He thinks of the addressee, the female addressee, as a fictionalized character of his own. Many, of course, of his poems are actually in fictions, his fictions, as like the Mexican hymns in the Plume Servant. Poems, of course, never not steeped in tradition for everything that Eliot said. Tradition of some sort, his own and other people's, and of course, not to be thought as formally, untraditionally. Lawrence believed in free verse. Free verse, of course, a misnomer whenever it appears. The freest of modern verse, and look as if they're particularly free, turn out not to be free at all. That is to say, they're bound. Traditional aesthetics says, how do you know a work of poetry from a work of prose? Well, poetry is not just steeped upwards, high in metaphor, but words that appear in lines, yes, as opposed to prose, which occurs in blocks, but words that are bound together. They're tied together. And how are they tied together? They're tied together by rhyme. And of course, by rhyme, they didn't just mean end rhyme, rhymings at the end of lines, end rhyme, which traditionally has got specialized as rhyme, but all kinds of repetition, rhyming, bits of words, phrases, whole sentences, and certainly the beginnings of words, so-called front rhyme, what has come to be called assonance is rhyme, middle rhyme, and end of line repetition. Of course, rhyme, but it's not only rhyme. And it's sometimes thought that the absence of end rhyming makes poetry free. And then you look at these poems, you find, like Lawrence's, absolutely repeating, echoing, bound words. Anyway, today's poems, the poems I want to talk about, are intended to represent some of the main categories of his writing. Poems of selfhood, of remembrance, which are highly religious, poems about nature, and never far from what we've learned to think of as self-reflexive material. That is to say, writing poems about poems, art about art, the poet in the poem reflecting on what he or she does. I start with piano. I hope you've all got a copy of the handout. I'm going to take my coat off. Talk about sweating men. Yes, piano. A very early poem, appeared in the volume New Poems 1918, called Piano. Or, as Lawrence put it, piano. Softly in the dusk, a woman is singing to me, taking me back down the vista of years, till I see a child sitting under the piano in the boom of the teeming streams, and pressing the small, poised feet of a mother who smiles as she sings. This is one of his so-called rhyming poems, end rhyming. In spite of myself, the insidious mastery of song betrays me back, till the heart of me weeps to belong to the old Sunday evenings at home, with winter outside, and hymns in the cosy parlour, the tinkling piano our guide. So now it is vain for the singer to burst into clamour, with the great black piano appassionato. The glamour of childish days is upon me. My manhood is cast down in the flood of remembrance. I weep like a child for the past. It is, of course, traditionally rhyming, end rhyming, but it is about rhyme in the sense of repetition at large. The modern event described, listening to the piano, is a rhyme of what went on in his childhood, listening to a smaller, cheaper, more working class instrument. The tingling strings of now, recalling the tinkling of the old piano at home. It is a poem about being at home, that great location for Lawrence's imagining and thinking. It is about music, music so important. This isn't a matter of hymns, but it is a musical moment. A woman is singing as hymn singers do. It is about the force of singing. A memory. The woman now singing recalls the mother then, the mother so dominant in Sons and Lovers, etc., and in Lawrence's line. The foundation of this experience, this modern aesthetic experience. The pastness haunts, as it does in all of Lawrence's writing. And it is, of course, his personal, provincial, small-time past. This is a very class-conscious poem, as Lawrence's fiction is. It's a past that is unforgettable. You can't forget it. Can't forget it. It traps you. You are mastered by it. It's insidious. It's like a trap. A trap. You can't get away from it, whether you like it or not. And words like insidious indicate something that is not altogether comfortable and comforting. The flood of remembrance, any mention of flooding, and Lawrence is very interested in flooding in his fiction, recalls the flood of Noah. This experience, which recalls the good, is a recollection of, or a recognition of the ungood. This going back, remembering, writing about remembering, rhyming, repeating the past is, you can't get away from it, but it's not necessarily all the good. There's weeping, weeping. I weep now like a child. You notice the word, I mentioned the word glamour before, did I not? This is a glamour. Glamour, it rhymes with clamour in the last stanza. So now it's vain for the singers to burst into clamour with the great black piano, the passinato, the glamour of childish days is upon me. Glamour, glamour, which, as I said, of course, is the same word as grammar in our language. Glamour, grammar. The poem, as a grammatical thing, is about the grammar of aesthetic effect and affect. And it is overwhelming, overwhelming. Going home, as his fiction often did, in imagination and writing, is a matter of mixed feelings. The second poem on the handout, Nottingham's new university, another I poem, a classic poem of remembrance, another autobiographical poem, a poem in which the present and the past converge, they rhyme. The great subject of poetry, this rhyming machine. In Nottingham, that dismal town where I went to school and college, they built a new university for a new dispensation of knowledge. Built it most grand and cakily out of the noble loot derived from shrewd cash chemistry by good Sir Jessie Boot. Little I thought when I was a lad and turned my modest penny over on Boot's cash chemist counter that Jessie, by turning many millions of similar honest pence over, would make a pile that would rise at last and blossom out in grand and cakey style into a university where smart men would dispense doses of smart cash chemistry in language of common sense. That future Nottingham lads would be cash chemically BSc, that Nottingham lights would rise and say, by Boots, I am MA. From this I learned, though I knew it before, that culture has her roots in the deep dung of cash, and law is a last offshoot of Boots. It occurs in the late volume Pansies. It is a late poem. Lawrence was fond of the word pansies, as he was fond of pansies. Pansies, flowers, flower obsessed. Pansies, he knew, of course, came from the French word pensée, thoughts. That's why Sonny in Hamlet says pansies for thoughts. Okay, pensée. And he said that he wanted all the time to be reminding you that Pascal wrote his pensée and I write my pansies, my thoughts, as serious and as good and important as that great philosopher. That's an allegation, of course. The truth here rooted as ever, the truth of Lawrence's literature rooted in a provincial nonconformist heritage. Who was Jessie Boot? Jessie Boot was a Nottingham Methodist, well known in the Lawrence family, the law of the family, because his maternal grandfather, who was a Congregationalist, was involved in a dispute with Boot over the control of a chapel in Stainton in Nottingham, just down the road from Lawrence. In a letter to his editor Garnet in 1915, Lawrence reflected ironically on thus being related to Jessie Boot. He talks about himself as, unfortunately, a grandchild. I'm a grandchild of my mother's nonconformist father, but I'm also, in a curious way, thus related to Jessie Boot. I'm a kind of grandchild of Jessie Boot, certainly of the world of Jessie Boot, as he was, and he hated Jessie Boot because Jessie Boot had booted him out of Boot's lending library. The Prussian officer was disgusting, said Jessie Boot, I'm not having it put about by my lending library, and he kept a special copy which he bound especially with all the disgusting parts marked, which he would give to people who objected to the fact that he was censoring D.H. Lawrence. I bring this poem to you not just because it is so typical of Lawrence's poems, which are all about remembering and returning. Isn't it so much about turning, and the lines do that turning. I turned my modest pen over, and the poem turns over into the next line, and that's repeated a bit lower down. There's a turning over, and a turning. I turned over my pennies, and I now turn over my poetic lines, and I recall all the millions of honest pence that were turned over, and then it's done again, that made Jessie Boot's fortune. Boot paid for the building housing Lawrence's old University College. Interestingly, in the Lawrence life, one of the big chiefs in the celebration to open that building in July 1928 was a man called Ernest Weekly. Professor Weekly, professor of language, Lawrence's old tutor, whose wife, Frida, Lawrence had run away with. There are, if you like, interesting echoes going on in this recollection. Jessie Boot, the past. Let's look at a bit more. There's religious remembering, as ever, a bit more of it all over the place, but in a slightly different poem, Masses and Classes I don't know whether Lawrence is thinking of a pun upon Mass, the Eucharist. I don't know. He might be. There are masses and there are classes. Or as he pronounced it, there are masses and there are classes. But the machine it is that has invented them both. The classes are so superior because they're the brains of the machine, and the masses are also so superior because they are the arms and legs of the machine. An old Frenchman uttered the truism, God cannot do without me. Certainly the God in the machine cannot. It has all the time to be soothed and consoled by the hands of life. A very characteristic late kind of punning reflection, which of course is about society. The word superior comes up, for example, in Lawrence's poem called The Oxford Voice, which is about how the Oxford voice is so superior, and he hates it for that reason. The classes are so superior. They're responsible for the mechanization of the world. He hates mechanization, industrialism, throughout, in poem after poem, text after text. But in between, as always, the masses are also so superior because they're the arms and legs of the machine. Bad bodies. An old Frenchman uttered the truism, God cannot do without me. That's Lawrence's continual reflection. God and me. An old Frenchman uttered the truism, God cannot do without me. He doesn't tell you who the old Frenchman is. Possibly it was a man called Pierre Bayle, a 17th century French skeptic, referenced, of course, by Ludwig Feuerbach, the very same, in the essence of Christianity as the possible source of this very line, in the form of God can as little do without us as we without him. Lawrence doesn't continue because only God cannot do without me. But of course, there is in his mind all the time that continuation, which he sometimes doesn't want to own up to, but has to always, because it's the case. God can as little do without us as we without him. A thought from the heart of the Protestant revisionist movement of Christianity on the continent. The next few poems on the handout, I have to keep an eye on the time, I won't dwell on, but they're there to allude to Lawrence's obsession with Jesus, and indeed his coming to think that he is Jesus, the risen Lord has risen in the flesh. It's obviously a phallic concept, the flesh rising, of course, as a modern version of the resurrection. Lawrence is obsessed with that. He, in his obsession with male flesh, is and orgasm and so on, is, he likes to think, the version of now of the resurrection in the body, like Jesus, the risen Lord. Then, of course, it goes on to meditate on this. But the point of bringing this in is just to illustrate the way in which the eye of Lawrence keeps turning into the eye of Christ, the self of Christ. Who's speaking? Who's speaking? When you get down towards the bottom of the poem, near the end, lo, I am flesh. Who's speaking? Is it Christ? Is it Lawrence? Who speaks? That's a good question to ask oneself all the time in I-dominated poetry. Who speaks when the text says I? And it's very often hard to distinguish the I of Lawrence, the voice of Lawrence, from the I, the voice, the selfhood of Christ. I won't go into that because of time, but this is a quite arresting illustration of these things. What do you want? Line 45 or so. What do you want? Wild loins. What do you want? Warm heart. What wide eyes and wondering spirit? Not death. No, not death for your lot. Often this kind of colloquialism they ask. Which is Noli Me Tangere. I bring this in for your consideration, but for the time only in passing. Noli Me Tangere, of course, are the words of the risen Jesus. Noli Me Tangere, touch me not. Lawrence speaking in the voice of the resurrected Christ, Tamari, of course, after the resurrection. I sometimes think that it is also a protest of Lawrence against the people who brutalize him and censor him and jail his staff. Oh, never put your hand on me, you with mental fingers, and you with mental bodies, stay a little distance from me. Leave me alone. Noli Me Tangere. You censor me, you destroy me, you lock up my paintings, etc. Get off. Don't touch me. But it happens to be not accidentally the voice of the risen Christ. The root of our evil, again, on the next page of the handout. Yes, the root of our evil. Again, Lawrence as Jesus. Get thee behind me, Satan. The voice of Jesus to Satan is now the voice of D.H. Lawrence to the world. Of course, engaging with Satan in a way, bravely, in a way that he suggests Jesus was frightened to do. He was frightened to look around and see Satan bargaining the world away and so on. But not me. Not me is the thought. I say, get thee behind. I'm not afraid. Come, Satan, don't go dodging behind my back any longer. If you've got the goods, come forward, boy, and let's see them. I'm perfectly willing to strike a decent bargain, but I'm not having any dodging going on behind my back. But moving on to think about nature. This wonderful poem, Red Geranium and Godly Mignonette, one of the many flower poems, and of course the occasion of a reflection on Lawrence's own imaginative power, which he contrasts, at least first, with the imaginative power, the imaginary power of God. I'm better than God. God can't imagine a red geranium, but I can. And of course, not just a red geranium, but a mignonette. A mignonette is a small and amazingly fragrant yellowish white flowered plant. Lordy, lordy. And it's called godly because, as ever, these encounters with nature are, for Lawrence, a form of godliness. Godliness in play, godliness in question. Imagine that any mind ever thought a red geranium, as if the redness of a red geranium could be anything but a sensual experience, and as if sensual experience could take place before there were any senses. We know that even God could not imagine the redness of a red geranium, nor the smell of mignonette when geraniums were not, and mignonette neither. And even when they were, even God would have to have a nose to smell at the mignonette. And he doesn't. He doesn't have a body. Unlike me, Lawrence. You can't imagine the Holy Ghost sniffing at cherry pie heliotrope. I don't know what cherry pie is doing now. Cherry pie. The heliotrope flowers are sunflowers, yes, fragrant, but not particularly red. There is a stone called heliotrope, which is blood red. Maybe that's inspired by the cherry pie thing. I don't know. Anyway, you can't imagine the Most High during the Coal Age cudgelling his mighty brains, even if he had any brains, straining his mighty mind to think among the moss and the mud of lizards and mastodons, to think out in the abstract when all was twilight, green and muddy. Now there shall be tum tiddly and tum tiddly hey presto, scarlet geranium. We know it couldn't be done. God couldn't do it, but I can. Look, I'm doing it now. However, there's a but. But imagine among the mud and the mastodons, God sighing and yearning with tremendous creative yearning in that dark green mass. Oh, for some other beauty that blossomed at last. Red geranium. I mean, there's always a but. There's always a but. When he turns on his own position to amend it, revise it, criticize it, turn it round. He is a great debater with himself, especially in these important matters. Mind you, it is imagining that you are divine or more powerful than God is a form of arrogance. It is a very arrogant poem until that moment, and there is a great arrogance, of course, in Lawrence's rewriting. How's this one? When are we supposed to finish?
I think maybe we're thinking sort of 4:15ish then.
Yes, 4:15.
4:15.
Good. Okay. Right. Excellent. Snake. One of the most famous, duly famous poems, which I shall read. Unfortunately, I discovered that on the original handout that I'd misplaced some of the words. So what you're seeing on the screen is a manipulated and misaligned version of the poem Snake. It is the case that the top right-hand bit, beginning the voice of my education and going down to I felt so honoured, should actually follow on from line 21 there, and the section and yet those voices should follow then that section, the voice of my education. So the beginning and the end of this, of the handout are right. It's the middle bits that should be transposed. I'm sorry about that. I discovered this too late to alert my technological, mental advisor and doer. I'm sorry about that. I will read, the people in the room have got the amended version. I shall read it. It's long, but it's worth reading. A snake came to my water trough on a hot day, and I in pyjamas for the heat to drink there. In the deep, strange, scented shade of the great dark carob tree, I came down the steps with my pitcher and must stand and wait, for there he was at the trough before me. He reached down from a fissure in the earth wall in the gloom and trailed his yellow-brown slackness soft-bellied down over the edge of the stone trough and rested his throat upon the stone bottom. And where the water dripped from the tap in a small clearness, he sipped with his straight mouth, softly drank through his straight gums into his slack, long body, silently. Someone was before me at my water trough, and I, like a second comer, waiting. He lifted his head from his drinking as cattle do, and looked at me vaguely as drinking cattle do, and flickered his two-forked tongue from his lips, and mused a moment, and stooped and drank a little more, being earth-brown, earth-golden, from the burning bowels of the earth, on the day of Sicilian July, with Etna smoking. And then it continues properly with the voice of my education said to me, he must be killed. For in Sicily the black snakes are innocent, the gold are venomous. And voices in me said, if you were a man, you would take a stick and break him now and finish him off. But I must confess how I liked him, how glad I was he had come like a guest in quiet to drink at my water trough and depart peaceful, pacified and thankless into the burning bowels of the earth. Was it cowardice that I dare not kill him? Was it perversity that I longed to talk to him? Was it humility to feel so honoured? I felt so honoured. Continuing, and yet those voices, if you were not afraid, you would kill him. And truly I was afraid, I was most afraid, but even so honoured still more, that he should seek my hospitality from out the dark door of the secret earth. He drank enough, lifted his head dreamily as one who's drunken, and flickered his tongue like a forked knight on the air, so black, seeming to lick his lips, and looked around like a god, unseeing, into the air, and slowly turned his head, and slowly, very slowly, as if thrice a dream, proceeded to draw his slow length curving round and climb again the broken back of my war face. And as he put his head into that dreadful hole, and as he slowly drew up, stake easing his shoulders and entered farther, a sort of horror, a sort of protest against his withdrawing into that horrid black hole, deliberately going into the blackness and slowly drawing himself after, overcame me. Now his back was turned. I looked round, I put down my pitcher, I picked up a clumsy log and threw it at the water trough with a clatter. I think it did not hit him, but suddenly that part of him that was left behind, convulsed in undignified haste, writhed like lightning and was gone into the black hole, the earth-lit fissure in the wall front, at which, in the intense still noon, I stared with fascination. And immediately I regretted it. I thought how paltry, how vulgar, what a mean act. I despised myself and the voices of my accursed human education. And I thought of the albatross, and I wished it would come back, my snake. For he seemed to me again like a king in exile, uncrowned in the underworld, now due to be crowned again. And so I missed my chance with one of the lords of life, and I have something to expiate, a pettiness, which is a very religious poem, of course. An encounter poem, a poem about an encounter in Sicily, in Taormina, where Lawrence was, late in life, well, middle life. First published in the Dial in July 1921, so sort of about 1920. A snake. A snake who is, of course, archetypally the emblem of the devil, the tempter of the Garden of Eden, serpent, more dubious than any other creature, okay? Turning into a curiously godlike creature. This is, as it were, one of Lawrence's intense, orthodox, if you like, revisionist poems. The encounter with the serpent is a kind of satanic apocalypse. The hints of the apocalypse are, or indeed of apocalyptically minded Christians, are here. Around line 15 or so, and I like a second comer waiting. He's like a group of evangelical Christians who are awaiting the second coming of Christ, waiting. Here I am, like a second comer, and the second coming happens, and it's in the form of, not of Christ, it is in the form of this satanic creature, the serpent. The serpent, king of the underworld, the serpent who becomes godlike for now, for Lawrence now. Seeming licked his lips and looked around like a god, line 46. And trying to react against him, to hurt him, perhaps to kill him. He remembers voices that would say, if you weren't afraid, you'd kill him. Chucking the log at him is thought of as a sinful act, something that should be expiated. So the poem is a poem of expiation, an act of atonement for a sin, a crime. A sin against what? Against this alternative to God. There are lots of who notice this about voices. I said Lawrence is always doing the voices. It is about voices, voices that you hear, voices that advise you, voices that educate you. The voice of my education said he must be killed. Voices in me said if you were a man, you'd take a stick. Voices. They are thought of as to be resisted. Voices, not always a good thing for Lawrence, the man of voice. The reference to the albatross is very interesting. I thought of the albatross as a reference, of course, to Coleridge's great poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the traveller who killed a good bird. The albatross is a crime, a sin, a poem that realises the awfulness of this unforgivable sin, killing the albatross. And at the end of that poem, the ancient mariner talks to the wedding guest, talks about what he's learned from this experience. This experience for him, a religious matter. It's an irreligious encounter that he has made with the natural creature. And I quote, "He prayeth well, who loveth well, both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best, who loveth best, all things, both great and small. For the dear God, who loveth us, he made and loveth all. It's not accidental that Lawrence would produce a volume of poems called Man and Bird and Beast. Of course, the message of the ancient mariner, which is being recalled here, I thought of the albatross and wish he would come back, my strength. He doesn't. It's a sin. It's an action which is presented or hinted at as a repeat of the co-religion, irreligious act, an act against nature, the divinity of nature, the godly mignonette. Isn't it interesting how in Paul Morel's life in Sons of Lovers Wear, at one point where he finally is going to get rid of Miriam, he puts some flowers in his mouth and chews them and spits them out. The way you deal with the natural world is a moral matter and a religious matter for Lawrence, always, and this poem brings it home. The religious and the Christian literary force in this poem is very strong. I came down the steps at the beginning. I must stand and wait. I just stand and wait. Everybody would know this is the recall of Milton's sonnet 19, where it's a poem about reflecting on his blindness, about how he is disenabled as a blind person, a blind poet, from serving God through his poetry. I'm failing to serve God. And then he reflects, they also serve who only stand and wait. I think not accidentally, the poet positions himself in that Miltonic position. Must stand and wait. This is a place where you can prove yourself to be a true servant of God, and actually he fails. It's not accidental, by the way, and your ears would have pricked up to see that he, all things both great and small, for the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. That this was recalled, of course it was, in that famous children's hymn by Mrs. Alexander, all things bright and beautiful, the Lord God made them all. That Coleridge poem has had widespread repercussions. I also can't help but think that this is a poem that recalls a famous poem of Edward Thomas called Adlestrop. We have this encounter in the heat of summer, that day of Sicilian July. In that Edward Thomas poem, Adlestrop, I remember Adlestrop, the name, because one afternoon of heat, the express train drew up there unwontedly. It was late June, and it's a time of harvest and bird singing, of natural rejoicing over the machine. Edward Thomas, of course, published that poem in his volume. It was posthumous, 1917, after he died in the First World War poet, Lawrence writes a lot of First World War poems, by the way. This snake draws up silently. I think there's a kind of, in the heat, like the express train drawing up unwontedly. There are all kinds of, the poet declaring himself to be a keen reader of modern verse as well as ancient verse. A matter of silence, of course. He's very drawn to both the noise of nature, the voice of God in the voice of birds and creatures and so on. But at the same time, he's also aware of the force of silent communication in the Bible, the still small voice of God. This encounter is a silent one. The only noise that is made by the poet, who throws the block with a clatter. That's the only noise in the poem. Otherwise, this encounter, this, if you like, pastiche, even pseudo divine encounter, is silent. A silence broken by the ill-advised poet. Quick look at a couple of other poems before we close. Bavarian Gentians. Lawrence was in Germany, in Bavaria, and in late in his life, September 29, in Bavaria, back in Germany, and had seen flowers. He looked at flowers a lot, wrote about them a lot, and he's dwelling on flowers per se, you might say, but also, of course, in his usual way, drawing out meaning from them. Not every man has gentians in his house in soft September at slow South Michaelmas. Bavarian gentians, big and dark, only dark, darkening the daytime, torch-like, with the smoking blueness of Pluto's gloom, ribbed and torch-like with their blaze of darkness spread blue, down, flattering into points, flattened under the sweep of white day, torch flower of the blue smoking darkness, Pluto's dark blue days, black lamps from the halls of Dis, burning dark blue, giving off darkness, blue darkness, as Demeter's pale lamps give off light. Lead me then, lead the way, reach me a gentian, give me a torch, let me guide myself with the blue forked torch of this flower down the darker and darker stairs, where blue is darkened on blueness, even where Persephone goes, just now, from the frosted September to the sightless realm, where darkness is awake upon the dark, and Persephone herself is but a voice, or a darkness invisible, enfolded in the deeper dark of the arms plutonic, and pierced with the passion of dense gloom among the splendour of torches of darkness, shedding darkness on the lost bride and her groom. That's a reference, of course, to the story, the ancient story of feminine rivalry, which led into hell, in which Aphrodite egged Pluto, ruler of the underworld, on to abduct Persephone, which he does. He abducted her, caught her, took her down to Dis when she was picking flowers. A story that attracts Lawrence for many reasons, not least one of which is that his fiction, we see that in Sons and Lovers and elsewhere, is all about the rival females. Rivals feel love for you as Pluto, king of the underworld. it's of course a poem taking us down, wanting to go down into the underworld, the world where the serpent came from, which is presented in terms which take up traditional ideas of, as it were, Christian or biblical experience. The blaze of darkness, the blaze of darkness. Must recall Milton's poem about his blindness in the shape of Samson, who was blinded, the blind hero, dark, 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 amidst the blaze of noon, the blaze of darkness. Milton, of course, seeing, if you like, though blind, always for him there is a religious connection. Samson, betrayed, blinded, but eventually pulling the house of the Philistines down. Darkness visible, very Miltonic, of course. Darkness visible, but also kind of linked, there's always a but, as darkness invisible. Well, is it visible or is it invisible? I don't know. Reach me a gentian, give me a torch, let me guide myself. Remember Paul Morel saying, I will guide myself, I'll find the way, let me guide myself. Reach me a gentian, give me a torch, the flower as a torch, the flower as leading the way. Famous blue flowers, of course, blue in the northern hemisphere. It's seen them, been impressed by them in Germany, leading the way. Okay, the flower leads me. At the same time, it's my way. The I, the me of these poems, going his own way, though at the same time leaning on the natural guide. It is, of course, not a good ending. There's always that turning around, the botness of these poems. Okay, so it's a good thing in some ways, a good thing to go down into the visible darkness. It turns out, of course, to be a voice that is the voice of an invisible darkness. Well, visible and invisible, a deeper dark. It's about love, of course, the body, sex, certainly passion down there in dis, in hell, the opposite to heaven, the opposite to orthodoxy. A great thing about it, of course, and this is very characteristic of Lawrence's art and Lawrence's poetry, not least, he doesn't get there. He wants to get there.
Question going on. Yeah.
To this place.
So I'll go back to where exactly.
Reach me a gentian, give me a torch, let me guide myself down,
that is a bit
down
strange,
where blue is darkened on blueness, where Persephone goes, to the sightless realm where darkness is awake upon the dark. Persephone herself is but a voice.
Ploughing on a bit.
I want to go there.
It was supposed to be ending about now anyway.
But it doesn't.
So I'm not concerned. I saw most of it. That's not my concern.
It's just an aspiration.
I wasn't continuing.
That is in the sense
about
the characteristic of Lawrence's whole life and work. He's
it
always
is more,
aspiring.
it wasn't the one I was
Get there.
Yeah, exactly.
Where
it wasn't one I
it
had to
matters.
keep up with. It was one where everyone was watching but they weren't in.
He never gets
So
there to the satisfying place.
but it does seem
Ever. He's always desiring
except that it has no
wanting a
connection.
guide.
It's going to crash anyway
and
because
saying, I can guide myself.
Yes, you may put the flower table back in as
And what about speakers? Shall I give them a
I can hear other
Final
voices.
election, Man of Tyre. And I
Which is
reflect on this because,
I can't hear you, Val.
again, it's a poem
the pointy one to the speakers and the calm one, I think it's
of
got to be.
aspiration,
I can work that. I'll have to work it out
consummation.
myself. There's one with a green.
But in terms
Yeah, that's
of,
right. I have to follow the cable. Thank you. I'll switch them all back in.
and in terms of this rather awful
Very strange.
of Aphrodite,
Who
who is, of course, led Persephone astray, you might say. The Man of Tyre.
Yeah, well, he'll understand, won't he? Thank you.
Man of Tyre is, of course,
It's
a
just
label
very
from the
strange
Bible.
for one always as well.
Again,
Yeah.
always.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
The Man of Tyre,
Bye.
who in the Bible is the father of a craftsman, a maker, who was a model of the poet, of course, the father of Hiram, who was King Solomon's extraordinary, fabled maker of copper works and things for the house of God. The Man of Tyre, the Man of Tyre, the Man of Tyre. Lawrence, once again, imagining himself as something other, something good, something potent and connected with, if you like, power, creation, creativity, poetry. The Man of Tyre. The Man of Tyre went down to the sea, pondering for his Greek that God is one and all alone, and evermore shall be so. A reference, as often in Lawrence, to low verse, low stuff. It is a quote from the Christian folk song, Green Grow the Rushes O, about biblical groups. Do you remember the 10 Commandments, the 4 Gospel makers? Lawrence wrote poems about them. Those Gospel beasts and the 12 disciples, 10 Commandments, 4 Gospel makers. God is one and all alone and evermore shall be so. It's a great chorus from that folk song. And a woman who had been washing clothes in the pool of rock, where a stream came down to the gravel of the sea and sank in, who had spread white washing on the gravel banked above the bay, who had lain her shift on the shore, on the shingle slope, who had waded to the pale green sea of evening out to a shoal, pouring seawater over herself, now turned and came slowly back with her back to the evening sky. The good back, the good return, always returning is in question. Oh, lovely, lovely, with the dark hair piled up as she went deeper, deeper down the channel, then rose, a resurrection, shallower, shallower, with the full thighs slowly lifting of the wader wading shorewards, and the shoulders pallid with light from the silent sky behind, both breasts dim and mysterious, with the glamorous kindness of twilight between them. There's glamour again. And the dim blotch of black maiden hair like an indicator, like a traffic light, a car indicator, a pointer, giving a message to the man, the story, the figure, the mythic encounter, if you like, a message. Which is not actually told what it is. We have to assume it's something good. So in the cane of break, always the poet in nature. He clasped his hands in delight that could only be God-given and murmured, lo, God is one God. But here in the twilight, godly and lovely, comes Aphrodite out of the sea towards me. God is one God. It registers the way one. God is there's only one God. Whether in a Christian manifestation of his youth or in other religions, other mythologies. There's only one God. God is God. But here in the twilight, godly and lovely, comes Aphrodite. There's always a but actually I'm inside this particular, if you like, pre-Christian business or story. Here in the twilight, godly and lovely, comes Aphrodite out of the sea towards me. And it stops there. As always, there is no consummation, there's no fulfillment. The poet who imagined himself as the father of the great mythical, biblical craftsman, the man of Tyre, seeing wonderfully the godlike female coming out of the sea towards me. It's always me, but there's no suggestion of actual arrival. It stops right there. She's coming. She's moving towards me, like I moved a lot towards the desired destination of consummation. And it stops there. It doesn't happen. They don't meet. And you might say that it's a poem which also relies heavily on the meeting of different versions, concepts of God and creativity. The man of Tyre, me, the poet, the man with the Christian heritage, deep inside an alternative pre or post-Christian world and situation and selfhood. It's about that. It's about a desired convergence which celebrates unconvergence, always in between. Okay, thank you. You stop there. Is that a good place to stop?
It is.
I do that and that. We've just heard Val draw to a close. I'm just going to put us on gallery view, or maybe at home we're on gallery view. I love that definition of a poem, words bound together.
Oh, yes.
I remember at A-level, which is 200 years ago, so many discussions on what makes a poem and the idea that words are bound together. And all that session on the poetry, wonderful, Val, thank you so much. And the first session on the novels, especially Sons and Lovers, so much. Now, someone's texted, and I see there's something in the chat. So just very briefly,
Are you in the chat room?
I'm in the chat room. Now, Val, I've muted you, but if you come close to here, if you wish to say something, feel free to say anything. But I've got words of wisdom about cherry pie heliotrope. We do have an awesome collection of people here at OCSG. From the BBC Gardening Plant Finder, heliotrope is a cherry pie plant.
No.
So there we go. We learn something new every session, don't we?
That's wonderful.
Every session.
I spent quite a lot of time looking up heliotrope and never came across that suggestion. Well.
Well, all one needs to do is ask the OCSG family, and they'll come back to that.
That's lovely.
Just before I press end of record, be good to record our thanks so much to Professor Val Cunningham and those of us here in the building, if we can clap very loudly. And thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us either here or at home. And do keep an eye on the website for our next wonderful event.
26th of October.
26th of October.
St. Teresa and the Garden of
St. Teresa and the Garden of Our Souls. I imagine that might be someone talking about St. Teresa, but if it's St. Teresa herself, that would certainly be well worth coming to. St. Teresa, that would be wonderful. Garden of Our Souls, 26th of October. Just before All Souls Day.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I will end recording now.